Anthony Chiasson. I'm the city's Division Chief of Archives, and by profession, I'm a religious historian. What we did for the 158th celebration, I wanted to propose a series of lectures during the year, and I did a first one. I promised this one for the people that were here before for the first lecture. It's going to be less somber than Rachel Paquin's story. I proposed for the 150th a series of 4 lectures during the year. This is the second one. The third one is going to be in September, and it's going to enter the season of Halloween and autumn and fall, so it's going to be more along the line of folkloric history of Westmount, and I'm going to end the series with a presentation on during the War Memorial Day. So I'm going to end that there. But today we're going to dive into what we would call social history. Just by the title of the lecture, we take care of our own Westmount, Montreal's social distinct microcosm, 1920-1970. En français, vous pouvez le lire, mais nous prenons soin des nôtres, Westmount, un microcosme socialement distinct, 1920-1970. Basically, the source documents that I had to research for this lecture were City Council minutes from 1920 to 1970, General Committee minutes, correspondence between the City of Westmount officials and provincial government institutions, social welfare applications, 1920-1970, health services application, 1920-1970, mental institution applications, hospital applications, 1920-1970, Westmount population census, Westmount annual reports, and on and on and on, so I can construct this lecture. As an introduction, how do we define social history as an historian? There's been a lot of talk of how you define social history since the 1960s. The most common definition would be that social history is a branch of history that emphasizes social structures and in the interaction of different groups in society rather than affairs of the state. Social history is sometimes described as the history of the people or the history from below. It emerged as an alternative to conventional political history, both in terms of its objects and interests and in belief deep-rooted in economic and social factors as agents of historical change. Today, for our lecture, I'm going to combine the two. And what we'll examine in the social history of Westmount is from below and from on top, in order to determine Westmount's identity through its history. What can define a city's identity in general? Cities were formed as an expression of spiritual, material, social, and political conditions. The changes in these conditions from one city to another makes each one a unique, unrepeatable phenomenon. Since the city is a humanitarian institution, it is in a constant state of change. As the communities and their circumstances are changing through time, cities reflect as well as shape their inhabitants, values, and outlooks in various ways. Each of these changes constitutes a time layer represented by a material reality in the physical structure of the city. So if we dive into Westmount, what is so distinctive about the city of Westmount? Before Westmount was incorporated, first as a town and then a city, the geographical location of what was to become Westmount was largely farmland with views on the mountain, which was, by the time, a delightful sight. Even if Montreal's population was increasing nonstop since the middle of the 19th century, the area that we know today as Westmount was somewhat ignored by Montreal's inhabitants, especially the bourgeois. the ones that could actually afford to move there, because it was considered too far to travel and to live. However, Montreal's population at the time was increasing heavily due to immigration. The waves of immigration brought all sorts of health risks, epidemics, diseases, overpopulation. What resulted in this was that people started leaving their neighborhoods for better living spaces, especially the very English Protestant bourgeoisie in Montreal. Westmount welcomed its share of these Montrealers looking for a better life from the end of the 1870s to the end of the 19th century. So, just to give you an idea of the increase in population in Westmount, according to the Census of Canada in 1881, as you can see, Westmount's population count was 884. This increased dramatically by 1891 with a population of 3,076. The population, as you can see in the table up to 1941, just kept increasing decade after decade. The choice of Westmount as a prime location to accept this wave of inner-city migration wasn't random. Situated on the northern part of Mont-Royal to the southern parts, where we have a view of the whole city, due to its altitude on the mountain and the dominant winds coming from the west, citizens that lived in Westmount were protected from air pollution that was the results of intense industrial activities going on in Montreal at that time. Also, by the end of the 19th century, several events contributed in the acceleration of the development of the region and to break with its francophone agricultural past. The people, mainly la bourgeoisie, living in Westmount, were not very tolerant to this transformation from rural to urban. Its residents even go as far as putting pressure on municipal officials to develop a series of parks so that residential constructions wouldn't overpower their green spaces. In 1881, Westmount signed an agreement with the Montreal Street Railway to establish electric streetcar lines, running on St. Catharines and Sherbrooke Streets, Victoria and Green Avenue. This was done so the trip from downtown Montreal wouldn't be too long. Come 1893, the majority of the streets are paved, and a large part of the territory has access to lighting, water, sewage, and even snow was always removed promptly from roads, and sidewalks were always kept clean, which was contrary to what was going on in Montreal at the same time. 1895 marked the year that Westmount first appears as a town with council members, almost all composed of English Protestant descendants. Westmount's population in the first decade of the 20th century passed from around 3,000 to 14,000. What we see here, what we begin to see here is Westmount's identity was already being forged by this time, defining itself as a very traditional English town. We see it by first looking at the ethnic origins of Westmount's population. So between 1881 and 1911, the percentage of citizens of Westmount being of British origin is almost constantly around 90%, with Francophones being 8% and others being the rest of the percentage. Westmount City Council was composed of a majority of Protestant English and were part of this bourgeoisie. We observed during this period a flagrant segregation between members of this haute bourgeoisie composed of merchants, financiers, industrial barons who lived and had houses built on top of the mountain, of course, while members of the petite bourgeoisie, comprised of accountants, lawyers, engineers, who lived in the southern part of the municipality. This dominant English class in Westmount saw an opportunity to extend its influence to carry over the ideal of an England within Montreal. With Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1887, council members were interested in a more lasting project, and a group was appointed to consider options. The decision was to build a free public library, the first public library in the province of Quebec. It didn't stop there. In 1898, the elites in Westmount signed a petition requesting the building of a municipal center for public meetings. It was in 1899 that Victoria Hall was opened. By 1909, Westmount had its charter and had the title of city, being composed primarily, again, of English Protestants. Members of the city council wanted to maintain the idea of Westmount being the Little England. Even with the construction of buildings heavily influenced by English design, in order to preserve its identity, Westmount knew that the social milieu was more stable and fluctuated a lot over multiple generations. However, the social construct was more easily modifiable. What this entailed was to put into place methods restraining access to this community, to encourage or limit certain behaviors and strictly discourage any form of nuisance. A first example of this resided in the construction code and zoning plans. These acted as social filters towards what was considered lower classes. Row houses, duplexes, triplexes, apartment buildings, houses, and all these types of building constructions were blocked by these bylaws and zoning plans. Another example of restraint resided in Westmount City Council view on morality. These men favored strict temperance laws and a rigid standard of decorum. Bylaw number 196, passed in 1909, stately affirms that, and I quote, all gambling houses, houses of ill fame, and houses of assignation are hereby prohibited and forbidden. Also, every description of gaming, cards, dice, cockfighting, or dogfighting is prohibited. It also imposed speed limits. No person shall ride over or drive faster than an ordinary trot. Professional taxes, licenses, and permits were put into place to discourage people or businesses with lower sense of morality to come to Westmount. A first bylaw was passed and imposed a tax of $500 per year to slaughterhouses, curing houses, rendering houses, dye houses, and soap factories. Business owners in Westmount paid $20 per year in tax, but the amount was $200 per year for pawnbrokers, secondhand dealers, junk dealers, etc., etc. This was an excerpt taken from Bylaw 286. The city of Westmount went even further in order to preserve its initial social identity by creating its own police force. Westmount Council wanted to ensure that the city remained clean, green, and safe for its citizens. At the police station, the constables were given smart uniforms, modeled on those of the British Bobby. The well-known hat with its tall, rounded top was issued in blue for winter wear, and white for summer. Westmount police played a vital role in order to ensure Westmount's image and identity was preserved. Even the Director General once noted that, and I quote, "The efficiency of the police department and manner in which justice is handed out has a lot to do with the absence of crime in our city." And just on a side note, this is not a quote that's taken out of context. I consulted all the police books, all the crime books that we have in our archives, and Westmount police were extremely busy for any type of, I wouldn't even consider it a nuisance, just kids sliding down a hill. Like, we have a massive amount of, everything was controlled. Everything was controlled by the police force in Westmount. The goal of Westmount's elite was to ensure that the city kept its social identity. This was the number one factor. This identity being that when you lived in Westmount, it was like you were on vacation year-round. And this is a saying that is all over the archives. Municipal councilors, everyone that was at a hand of administrating the city back then, wanted absolutely that their citizens feel like they were on vacation all the time while living there. So, however, the rapid development of the city and its population increase resulted in a collision of two ideas. Even though that Westmount put insane amounts for taxes and forbidded certain activities, there's still small merchants that came to Westmount, that moved to Westmount. People moved to Westmount from what was considered la petite bourgeoisie. And what happened is that there's two ideals that started to collide in the city back then. One group of citizens saw the boom as an opportunity for an economic and social windfall. The second group wanted to conserve Westmount's rural character and quiet streets, green parks, basically to keep tradition. We have seen that Westmount's leaders tried by every means to conserve its initial social identity of being a traditional English-centered city. In the decades that followed 1910, this social construct known as Westmount will ultimately be forced to adapt and evolve. Let's examine what happened here. So Westmount and social change. In the first decade of the 20th century, a lot of changes were happening in and around Montreal. The city of Montreal was booming, shipping and railway facilities had transformed the economy. What was considered middle-class families were becoming more and more present, and many of them saw Westmount as a place where they could live. In Westmount, more and more people from different economic, social, religious backgrounds became citizens. Houses were built, duplexes were built, triplexes were built, but mostly on the southern part of the city. A citizens group called the Westmount Municipal Association was formed and announced plans to hold regular meetings in Victoria Hall. This group's objective was to encourage public discussion on all municipal affairs, then inform City Council on the results. Families were crowding into areas above Sherbrooke Street where houses were beginning to climb the mountain. All construction of houses were beginning to fill up the mountain. With this population increase and economic development, Westmount's population now covered a wide range of occupations, mostly being white collar. There were railway employees, clerks, sales personnel, small merchants, medium merchants, textile people. The traditional old view of Westmount was being changed little by little. There was even an attempt to annex Westmount to Montreal in the first decade of the 20th century. It was a fight that Mayor William Trenholm took on, with the citizens' support, of course. It was said in a council meeting from 1910 that, and I quote, Westmount cannot, in view of the unanimous opposition of its citizens to such a project, become a party to any negotiations to such annexation. Westmount is firm in its matter, not because of the possibility of increased taxes, but against the spread of decadent morals. End quote. We can see here hints of both Westmount's identities that were already in place and starting to grow. The old traditional speaking, the old traditional Westmount speaking or moral, or this new in which council members listens to the desires of the citizens. This is why the Westmount Municipal Association was an influential organization because it gave a voice to the citizens. And this is what past councillors and past mayors were lacking, is that they did what they thought and what they grew up was right without necessarily listening to the citizens. So this municipal association gave a voice to the citizens that were living there, not only the bourgeoisie, but every citizen that was there, that lived in the city. Between 1900 and the end of the 1920s, Westmount was caught in a social identity crisis. The world was changing around this little geographical space. There was a huge struggle between preserving the old traditions, like I said, and also being open to the emerging economic and social order. The Canadian government, on their side, were encouraging immigrants to leave Europe. Many British citizens came to Montreal, and the majority settled in Westmount. This wave of immigrants fed the Elder Council members' desire to keep Westmount's old traditional identity. English schools with British curriculums were constructed. City buildings, who were designed mostly by Robert Findlay, had all a very English medieval manner style of architecture. We still see it today, this influence. However, the resurgence in the old ways will be altered in the next decades to come. Westmount's identity would suffer profound changes. The Wall Street crash of 1929 had a profound effect in the lives of every Canadian. Westmount was no exception. With the newly settled middle class, the effects of the economic crash was apparent. An article written in the Westmount Examiner states this clearly in 1931, and I quote, "The government has shown absolutely no interest in the welfare of all classes mentioned. What it means for the unemployed white-collar worker to be without employment over a period of years, for a retail merchant to lose all he had, and the professional man deprived of the opportunity of earning a living or of earning a livelihood, is only understood and appreciated by those in these classes, and who are the unfortunate victims of the Depression." And this has to be put into context, because the quote is basically referring to a new middle class. The higher bourgeoisie of Westmount, some were affected by the economic crash, but mostly came out of it pretty okay. Westmount would have found another way to counter the effects of the Depression on its population, mostly middle class, like I was saying. One of the things that Westmount Council voted for was to employ all qualified, out-of-work engineers, architects, city planners living in Westmount. Projects were created for them so that they can earn a living while the Depression was going on. Roads and sewers were renewed and repaired by these people. What Westmount needed to do is cut back on all spending on their side. Any economical spending that was not necessary, they cut so they could create jobs for the middle class. Manual work was also made available, like cleaning vacant lots, weeding park lawns. But this is another thing that has to be put into social context. Westmount Council creating jobs for middle class, like cleaning vacant lawns, weeding parks. You have to bring this in a bigger perspective, that all of this is keeping the city alive, is keeping the city clean, is keeping the city basically running in the middle of a Great Depression. So it was actually pretty brilliant at the time that they thought about this. In order to accommodate these new workers, the city had to cut spending considerably, like I said, in the beginning of the Depression. A relief system was even established by the city. Between 1932 and 1935, 1,322 people were helped with food, shelter, clothing, and fuel. This was taken from Aline Gobi's book. But when we see the numbers of 1,322 people compared to the population that's around 14 or 15,000, it doesn't seem like a lot, but it's still close to 10% of the population. Westmount, with the help of its health officer, made available to its most needing citizens a provincial program called the Quebec Public Charities Act, which acted as Quebec's main public funding structure for healthcare from 1921 until 1958. Except that from 1921 and a few decades later, no one really understood how it worked. But in the mid-30s, municipalities around Quebec were using more and more this Charities Act. The QPCA involved a commitment of the municipal and provincial government to sponsor a portion of the cost of care of indigent patients in the cities or people in need. It was, like I said, it was put into place in 1921, and the majority of the assistance that was given by the city in the 1930s involved hospital fees, birth fees, injury allowances, job losses, children's services, income allowances, and applications for assistance had to be addressed to City Hall and examined by the health officer and or members of council. Let's take a look at some examples of these requests. This is the type of request that came into the city. That was typed up. I had to black out all the names and addresses for question of la loi 25 ou la loi sur les renseignements personnels du Québec. But it still gives an idea. It still gives you an idea of what it comprised to apply for that type of aid. And we'll go through it. So quickly, there was a female, age 28, housewife, address, whatever. The hospital institution was Royal Victoria Hospital. Her husband of patient is unemployed. Since coming to Canada, he has been employed by, which is blacked out, earning $1.10 an hour. Due to illness, he was compelled to stop working until he started to work with Canadair at $45 a week until laid off in December. He had 3 weeks employment with T. Eaton Company at $44 a week during the Christmas season. The family consisted of a man and a wife and 4 children, ages 4.5, 3.5, 2, and 1 month. Up to now, father of the family has not been eligible for financial assistance. Patient and her husband, rent receipts. This is a particular case, but it happened a lot in the applications because we have over 7,000 applicants throughout the years. It was firstly refused by the Quebec province, but accepted by Westmount. So Westmount decided to give funds to help pay for residents and hospital fees and whatnot to help this family out. Another hospital case here is a 45-year-old woman that was hospitalized in Montreal General Hospital. Patient is a single woman with no legally responsible relatives. She has poor health for many years. Whenever she's able to work, she does light house and cleaning work. She has been known to helped over a period of years. Patient has now established legal domicile in Westmount and was eligible for the QPCA. And what we need to know with the QPCA, it had to be, like, even if Westmount accepted, the provincial government could refuse and vice versa. But what's going to be interesting in Westmount for all these applicants, it's what's going to go on after the 1930s. But all these applications for the QPCA for hospital cases, these are just the hospital cases, were right now, like the 2 examples that I showed here, it's a woman that cleaned houses. It's a man that worked for Canadair. But there are multiple examples of elites that ask for help. They lost a lot of money investing and whatever, but they were all accepted also for the QPCA. Because what Westmount did is that they asked for, the province didn't ask for a lot of details, but the Westmount City Council asked for a lot of details in regards to what happened to every family, what happened economically, socially, that they found themselves in that position, and a decision was made afterwards. There were even hundreds of citizens that applied to aid by writing directly to the city. They didn't pass by the QPCA, they just wrote directly to City Hall. And this was in October 9, 1935. Information obtained, I made an error. Personally, I interviewed him at the General Hospital from September 1931 till September 1934. He resided at, and from September 34 till September 35, he was living at. On September 3rd, 1935, he moved where he lived until the day of his accident. He was employed by the city on relief work. His wages for a full week was $21. His wife is employed at, her salary is $25 per week, but she sends most of her income, I forgot the word income, home to Ireland to help with her folks. he is unable to pay his hospital bill. So these are the types of requests that were asked for Westmount. Another example here where they have, I'm not going to go through it again just because you guys can read it here, but there were a total of 7 children in the household, and they were unable to pay for anything towards hospital bills. So Westmount stepped in and paid the hospital bills for the family, basically. From the beginning of the 1930s, up until around the beginning of the 1940s, over 1,000 requests of all types of aid was requested by Westmount citizens. What's interesting here is that out of all the requests for aid during this period, very few were refused by the city. The ones that were refused were from people not residing in the city. This is quite remarkable because Westmount could not only rely on the QPCA for help. The provisions of the QPCA were inadequate for a number of reasons. However, firstly, Quebec was the only province that refused to supply insulin despite the Montreal General Hospital housing one of the largest diabetic clinics in the country. Secondly, the province refused to shoulder the cost of long-term care, the burden of which fell on individual hospitals and their social services departments. The QPCA also excluded costs related to anything that had to do with migrants and homeless people. The city of Westmount paid the difference of what the QPCA could not pay. The city also paid for requested aid in areas where government programs were not help in funding. Westmount's efforts to help its citizens overcome the Great Depression resulted in what the city and its population made that they were less touched by the effects of the Depression. This new proximity between Westmount and its citizens from all economic and social and religious classes was not a temporary relationship because of the Great Depression. Westmount's desire to be there and help its citizens continued way beyond the 1930s. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, thousands of requests from any type of aid coming from all classes were sent and examined by Westmount officials. When it came to health matters, very few were refused. Westmount paid for baby deliveries, like I said before, hospital fees, housing fees due to illness, lost wages. Westmount even paid some of you might know the existence of Weardale House in Westmount. That was a reform school for boys. There's a lot of boys there that went missing during the years that it was open. They would leave and the police couldn't find them. So when the police couldn't find them, Westmount hired private investigators to find them and bring them back to Weardale House because they were residents of the city. Westmount even paid for the boarding in different institutions of 298 abandoned or orphaned children until their age was mature. And the 298 are the ones that we have in the archives. And this was from the 1930s to the 1970s. It doesn't seem like a lot, but considering the sheer amount, and I talked about this in the last lecture about an example of one of these children that was taken in by Westmount. She lived until she was 22, and Westmount was still paying her board and sending her clothes in the institution that she was in. So, Westmount and its citizens after the Depression. Westmount's effort to help its citizens overcome the Great Depression that resulted in the city's population was, okay, yes, I talked about this. In the beginning of the lecture, I asked the question, why is Westmount so distinctive compared to other Canadian cities or even North American municipalities? Today, I talked about architecture, business development, social programs, community development, and events, parks, respect of tradition, basically everything that can go on in a society. So if we return and talk about Westmount's identity, we have clearly seen that in the beginning, Westmount's identity was focused on tradition. But with the changing world, the city quickly understood that tradition and modernity can coexist if the attention is put onto citizens and their role in the development of that society. For me, all of this, whether it be 19th century, 21st century, 22nd century, or beyond, brings me back to Westmount's motto all the time, which is, my strength is the faithfulness of my citizens. Westmount has always and always will put its citizens first. Throughout the history of the city, Westmount's officials have always understood that the success of the city resides in its citizens. Thank you very much.